20 years ago, our theaters were graced with the beginning of what stands as one of the greatest cinematic achievements of all time. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy is a once-in-a-lifetime triumph, and its insanely dedicated production landed at the perfect time to intersect several major shifts taking place in Hollywood. The budget, production time, and balance of practical and computer-generated effects are all key results of a perfect intersection of a madman's dream and the willingness of so many to give everything they had to this definitive fantasy series. Hollywood has made and will continue to make incredible movies since the release of The Lord of the Rings. While things may seem somewhat bleak, it'd be pretty pessimistic to think good movies died 20 years ago. You're welcome to think that yourself, but that is not my stance. However, this trilogy is an insane product of its time, and a miraculous intersection of 1,000 equally important pieces. How's it going, everyone? My name's Graham, and welcome to Two Left Frames. These movies mean the world to me, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity to gush about them, while also celebrating this monumental anniversary by taking a step back to marvel at what was achieved and outline why it's unlikely we'll ever see anything like the Lord of the Rings trilogy again. I am reworking and expanding this video to clarify a few points, correct the odd mistake, and hopefully improve the overall flow. I love you all for watching the original cut, and I hope you enjoy this thematically titled extended edition even more. As fans of these movies will know, it's extended editions or nothing. First, I'd like to look at and appreciate how unlikely it was for this trilogy of movies to be greenlit at all. I really can't oversell how influential Tolkien and his novels were not just to fantasy, but fictional works and storytelling as a whole. As one of the literal grandfathers of fantasy, nearly every dungeon you've ever quested in or dragon you've faced off with has some roots in Tolkien's work. He didn't create everything from scratch, but our collective concept of elves and orcs come nearly entirely from his original outline. Authors like Stephen King cites Lord of the Rings as the biggest influence on his epic, The Stand. And Tolkien's writing was so pivotal that it is commonly cited by almost every early sci-fi creator. I could go on, but to summarize, the majority of fantasy, sci-fi, and numerous other works of fiction owe it all to J.R.R. Tolkien. You could think this sort of prevalence would guarantee any adaptation of J.R.R.'s work all the gold of a dragon's hoard, but keep in mind that from a filmmaking perspective, this was still a totally unproven IP, asking for hundreds of millions of dollars and the goodwill to be allowed to produce multiple movies at once, put in the hands of a small-time director known for making low-budget horror. Husband and wife duo Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh would have recently picked up an Oscar nomination for Best Screenplay on Heavenly Creatures. That was probably enough to get them in the door and have them at least be taken somewhat seriously, but this small, borderline indie New Zealand production is a far cry from what they were proposing now. Not to mention that fantasy movies were seen as silly kids' fare with no real appeal for the general audience. Fantasy was entirely relegated to books and tabletop games. Hollywood is constantly cycling through different trends. We've been in the mega blockbuster superhero era for over a decade now. Many are probably familiar with the resurgences of popularity of fantasy after The Lord of the Rings and again after Game of Thrones. I think the main takeaway there is that Sean Bean is great for fantasy. But leading up to that, in the 90s, there's almost nothing. The 80s had all sorts of fantasy classics, but it was rare for them to be both commercially and critically approved, with some of the greatest successes coming from children's movies. But when analyzing the impact they had on future productions, we can't really look at their current legacy. Many of them have become appreciated in their time, being referred to as underrated or seen now as cult classics. But those aren't really metrics Hollywood producers are using when looking to greenlight a new IP. And considering the huge gap in interest during the 90s, nobody was all that keen to attempt to single-handedly revive the genre. You can even see the transition starting at the end of the 80s. Adult-oriented swords and sorcery fantasy were on their way out, paving the way for more family-friendly, broader styles of fantasy. Pretty well anything outside of a few kids' movies or comedies were total failures, like 2000's Dungeons & Dragons. Those movies didn't take themselves seriously, and neither did the audience. To say this trilogy was a risk would be wildly underselling it. And that's only from a pop culture perspective, let alone the actual cost associated with attempting this. Their budget was simultaneously one of the largest ever seen, yet made for a cost that pales in comparison to what is seen for the average blockbuster today. When averaged across 3 movies, you could view the $300 million cost as perfectly legitimate. Adjusting for inflation across 20 years, it's much closer to $500 million, and so this feels like a much more accurate price point for what it costs to make a blockbuster movie. But in recent years, that's really become the floor, let alone the budget necessary to produce the biggest movies ever made. It's a miracle that this trilogy was given that sort of money. Yet even more impressive that they were made for that little. I love that both of those statements are equally true for this trilogy. Now, taking on one of the most precious fantasy series of all time became the unlikely passion project of a niche horror director, whose budgets usually landed in the $5 million range, with his most expensive movie being $26 million. So at a time when fantasy adaptations were at an all-time low, always seen as childish or too nerdy, they were suddenly taken seriously by a man who made gory horror comedies, asking for nearly $300 million. Fat chance. Elite directors like Spielberg and Ridley Scott working on bankable movies would only just touch that $100 million range on the high end of their budgets. Asking for 3 times that all at once easily made The Lord of the Rings the most expensive production of all time. The only other pre-Lord of the Rings movie still on the list of most expensive films ever made is James Cameron's Titanic, which clocked in at a whopping $200 million. Originally, Jackson only came asking to greenlight 2 movies, but after quickly proving that he was onto something special, he was approved to expand it to a full 3. This trilogy was so ambitious that its upfront costs and production timeline are still seen as one of the biggest gambles ever taken. It spent many years in pre-production, making sure every detail of the script, design, costuming, previs, and everything else was perfect. And even then, they were changing things on the daily. It's easy to view it as all worthwhile in hindsight, but principal photography took 438 days, meaning all the cast and crew spent well over a year on these 3 movies, when the average principal for a single movie is only about 4 to 10 weeks, while they were essentially spending 20 weeks per movie. The Lord of the Rings was an epic on a scale seldom attempted, and for good reason. Jackson was pitching it as a fantasy Braveheart, wanting that realism and seriousness in his movie. Braveheart was backed by a mega superstar, Mel Gibson, and only capped out at a $70 million budget. And even with everything working in its favor, it only earned $200 million. Cracking $300 million at the box office could land you in the highest grossing movie of the year, let alone earning something closer to $500 million or a full-on billion that's much more commonly seen today. The $100 million budget movie was a new phenomenon, suddenly gambling that your movie needed to earn $200 million or more just to break even. That seems like small potatoes now, but this all came before Hollywood's hyper-inflated blockbuster approach, which is now all built on the foundation that your movie is pretty well a flop if it doesn't land in the top 10 movies of the year earning $500 million or more. This trilogy of movies that seemingly didn't have an audience coming from an unproven director now collectively had to earn at least $600 million, and if they wanted to be truly profitable, closer to $1 billion. And as we now know, it earned that several times over. But that's some big dollars to put it all on black and let it ride. There are only a few examples in the history of cinema that took anywhere near this risk, and frankly, the others either don't really come close or are somewhat incomparable. I touched on this in my unadaptable Dune video, as that was the literary franchise that had felt next most likely to be given the reverence and attention necessary to greenlight and fund a full film series all at once. The fact that Denis Villeneuve, one of our most celebrated working directors, tackling one of the most well-beloved and anticipated works of fiction of all time, in many ways seen as the sci-fi equivalent of The Lord of the Rings, couldn't even secure a deal for 2 films at once, let alone 3. Even now, Dune was approved for its part 2 and not 3. underscoring what a mountainous task it is to secure this sort of commitment from any studio. Shortly after Jackson's massive success, we saw franchises like The Matrix and Pirates of the Caribbean attempt to greenlight 2 movies at once each. The difference there is neither original movie was made with sequels in mind, and they were only approved for a second and third once the first movies proved to be massive successes. The Matrix sequels get some additional credit in my book for actually filming simultaneously, with the 2 of them matching the budget of all 3 Lord of the Rings movies, but also for having the sheer gall to release only 6 months apart. That's a unique risk all of its own. And as a tangent on a tangent, I want to praise the budgetary management skills for The Lord of the Rings, because even though these Pirates movies were only a half-decade later, the 2 of them cost 150% what it took to make all 3 Lord of the Rings movies. More recently, the Avengers 3 and 4 were originally announced as Infinity War Part 1 and 2, then set to be filmed simultaneously, but this was eventually split down the line into 2 separate movies, spending the time to develop them individually and not overwork any of the cast or crew. Those Avengers movies were 2 of the most anticipated movies in the literal biggest franchise of all time that were guaranteed to be funded, made, and billion-dollar box office hits each, and they still couldn't make the logistics of filming 2 movies at once work. There was then a window where every young adult novel adaptation did a Part 1 and 2 franchise ender. Harry Potter, Twilight, and The Hunger Games all took this route, but I don't think anyone could argue that those were a risk. Mission Impossible is now currently filming 7 and 8 at the same time. So again, our example is a proven mega-hit franchise which is aiming to wrap up the story before the lead actor kills himself by pulling some insane stunt where he tries to shoot himself out of a cannon into the mouth of a live lion. That series is also coming off a financial and critical high that all but guarantee they will see their return on investment. So while they've chosen to brave the back-to-back shoot, there's no real risk there. We now have the next 4 Avatar movies coming up. And I suppose an argument could be made for those to be on the same level, seeing both the time and money that's gone into those films, but 4 $250 million movies would never have been greenlit if they weren't following the literal highest grossing movie of all time. In the original cut of this video, I kind of took a needless dig at Avatar here, but after having some really awesome and engaging conversations in the comments, it actually reminded me how groundbreaking that movie was as well. And it made me wonder if this video should become the first in a series where I unpack these monumental and unlikely productions. I don't want to be a hater, so a video like that could be a good excuse to learn to appreciate these movies in a way I never fully have before. Maybe it would be worth doing once the sequel has been released, and others have suggested that the original Star Wars trilogy would be a good one to look at. I think that's a cool idea. Let me know what you all think. So while budgeting for and filming multiple movies at once has been attempted in similar ways to The Lord of the Rings a handful of times since, it's always been done as continuations of successful, lower-risk series. They are then often unable to manage the scheduling and logistics needed to pull it off. And quite frequently, they're left scrambling to cobble together the story for these sequels, having not built the 3 films in a way that serve as a beginning, middle, and end. They kind of exist as a very compressed beginning, middle, end at the start, with then a weird second, middle, and end with the next 2 movies. So from the perspective of their long-lasting appeal, The Lord of the Rings is always going to have that advantage. And above all else, in the same vein, that trilogy is the only one of these series that actually managed to maintain its quality from start to finish. It's one of the greatest film trilogies of all time, and actually managed to benefit from this insane production scale, rather than getting lost in its own mind-boggling marshes. Which leads me into the insane pre-production effort for this trilogy. A feat of collective creativity, ingenuity, skill, imagination, perseverance, and patience that is unlike anything that ever came before or likely will ever be seen again. The actual filming of this trilogy took place over a much larger stretch of time than would typically be seen. Like I said, principal photography lasted about 14 months. But what is even more mind-blowing than that is the amount of time that went into pre-production. Basically everything that takes place before the first time that director says action. Even if we exclude the multiple times The Lord of the Rings development changed hands, undergoing light development under various studios, and the early personal efforts from Jackson and Walsh starting back in 1995. If I instead start the clock once it found its home at New Line through to actual filming, The Lord of the Rings spent 26 months in production, nearly twice as long as it spent filming. 9 months per movie is actually pretty typical. Investors are forking over big bucks, but they'll be able to gauge progress quickly, month to month, comparing it to a vast history of production timelines to observe that everything is on track. But with 26 months of buildup, this means the studio had to fund over 2 years of work before cameras even started rolling, with no comparable examples to know their money was being well spent. 2 years is longer than it usually takes to go from pre-production through to a theatrical release. How about some examples? I could compare this to blockbuster movies in more recent years like Iron Man. Now, they may not immediately seem like a great comparison given the current landscape of how superhero franchises are just cranked out of this well-oiled machine, but Iron Man was another untested IP coming at a time when superhero movies were still seen as corny and made for kids or nerds, funded knowing fully well how much would ride on that one movie's success. Iron Man had also been in development on and off for many years, but major pre-production on films doesn't really begin until a director is attached. After Jon Favreau was hired, it took about 11 months before filming began. How about Iron Man 2? The same director signed on to return, and major casting was already complete, so you can hit the ground running, right? Well, that pre-production still took about 9 months. How about another blockbuster that released only a year before Fellowship? Something that came at a time that was a little less CGI reliant, and working at a similar time with similar resources. For this, I would look at a movie like Ridley Scott's Gladiator, an epic, action-driven period drama that would require loads of set, costume, and design work to bring to life. I couldn't find an exact timeline, but we know the first draft came in April 1998 and filming began the following January. So even this massive swords and sandal revival only spent about 8 months in pre-production, and Ridley Scott was barely given more than $100 million to do so. The Lord of the Rings' $300 million budget, 26 months of pre-production, and over a year spent filming are all staggering on a level I can't really describe. So many people gave so much of their lives to these movies. You can only remotely get a sense of it by watching the extremely extensive behind-the-scenes making of featurettes for these movies. If you're a fan of this film series and you've never watched these, nothing will make you appreciate the artistry of filmmaking more than watching these behind-the-scenes special features. It just reminds me how much I still miss really well-made special features. I don't want to see a 10-minute look at how things were made. I want to see 2 hours for every hour of film that was actually released. I want to share a few standout anecdotes from these special features, showcasing how not a single corner was cut, and the true love, care, time, effort, and craftsmanship that was put into these movies. No, the Hobbit actors are not running around barefoot. They made these shoes that look like bare, hairy feet that then needed to be molded and cooked in a special oven ahead of their fitting. The way they were glued on and hidden with the makeup, they then had to be destroyed to be taken back off. In order to achieve this, they had to run that oven 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and turned out 1,800 pairs of these feet over production. The Battle of Helm's Deep alone took 4 months to film, with nearly every day of filming needing to be a night shoot. That means this one battle took twice as long to film as most movies. The massive door for Helm's Deep was built so well that they weren't able to break through it with their battering ram. The team had to come into set and strategically weaken the door so that the actors could actually smash their way through. The groundbreaking software, Massive, was developed from scratch to handle the unprecedented scale of battles taking place, allowing for semi-automated animation to drive these epic scenes that could never be done with extras or hand animation. Massive allowed for up to 20,000 CGI orcs and soldiers to battle it out. This tech has since been refined, improved, and become an industry standard, being used in the likes of World War Z, Ben-Hur, and John Carter. The first movie would have included one more massive action set piece, coming towards the end of the film with an on-river ambush with boats crashing and flipping, and Legolas showing off astride the boat, firing arrows every which way, and the whole thing got washed away in a state of emergency level flood. Yeah, there are things in this already 12-hour wonder that didn't even make it to film. There are leaves constantly falling during the Council of Elrond, but this was actually filmed indoors. The solution? crew members spent weeks collecting real fallen leaves, but they turned brown too quickly, leading to them then being hand-painted to retain some color. A half-dozen crew members then stood above the set, dropping and collecting leaves throughout filming. The orcs forging weapons under Isengard were in fact staff members of Weta, in costume, crafting actual weapons that would then go on to be used in the film, which ended up being upwards of 2,000 weapons and 10,000 handcrafted arrows. The elephant-like Mummikil, aka the Oliphant, was the largest prop ever built, needing to be transported in pieces across over a dozen trucks to then be built on location. And my personal favorite, this has stuck with me for years, was this pair of guys whose only job it was for 2 years was to hand-link together 12.5 million rings to create chainmail. That is 13,000 rings and 3 days' work just to make one suit. And that's one of the easier styles of suits to craft. And then 3/4 of the thing is going to be covered in some tunic. These guys had calloused fingers, weird inside jokes, no fingertips, and seemingly loved every minute of it. The time needed to make movies this way simply isn't given anymore. With inflating costs, wonky Hollywood accounting that requires movies to earn twice the budget just to break even, the constant rush to turn movies around quickly, the arms race to capitalize on the newest trend, and through a million other potential factors, even the biggest movies made today aren't given anywhere near this length of rope to work with. But all that time and detail, the physical constructions, all of it was made tactile and tangible, and the more the actors can feel that, the more we, the audience, buy into it. You believe every second of this that you're seeing on screen because it's real. While the artistry of these films goes hand in hand with all the work put into pre-production, I felt I needed to single out the series' perfect intersection of skill and technology, which was entirely a product of its time. Remember how The Lord of the Rings was both incredibly expensive and incredibly cheap? Well, it also simultaneously has some of the best practical effects, costumes, sets, and designs ever crafted, while also making use of cutting-edge CGI that breathed additional life into the story that could not have been possible only a few years prior, and would have become too big of a crutch only a few years later. Anyone who's seen those behind the scenes are probably wondering why I didn't include examples like the famous bigatures, massive 2-scale miniatures that are really undersold by the term miniature. The bigatures were physically constructed to then be digitally merged with actual location shooting, taking maximum advantage of both mediums. Or look at the wildly complex feats of engineering and skill that created these rotating tables, a staggered horse carriage, multi-scale rebuilt hobbit holes, and 1,000 other examples of practical effects that allowed actors like Elijah Wood and Ian McKellen to physically share a scene while appearing to be completely different sizes from one another. I wanted to include moments like the bigatures or these forced perspective shots, or any other hand-built moment, to discuss what a relic this trilogy is in terms of CGI and effects. Why would you ever build this camera-tracked warping set-piece table when you can simply shrink one character in post-production? Peter Jackson came from a background of low-budget horror movies before any notable visual effect technology would have been available. He was no stranger to stretching both budgets and his imagination further than others. And now that it was available, it was potentially still cheaper and with a better end result to still do it in camera. It's what drove him to approach the world of Middle-earth with as much realism as possible. The few times simple green screen character shrinking was used is now kinda noticeable. Even at the time, you could tell something was maybe a little off. Whereas these forced perspective shots will never age a day. That same practical approach is why these horror-like orcs and other ghouls still look totally hardcore. You just don't get that snarling, physical, tactile grossness with CGI creatures. Creating a 3D model allows you to bend and twist your movie monster beyond humanoid proportions and limitations, but everything usually looks a little too clean. But the other side of that coin is CG creatures like the cave troll that still hold up shockingly well. Film somewhere dark, desaturate the whole scene, limit the amount it physically interacts with things, and yeah, I can't believe how good this still looks. They were working with the absolute best of what both practical and visual effects had to offer, blending the two near seamlessly, matching that suspension of disbelief that J.R.R. Tolkien's own writing was famous for. As a more highly specific example, but something that is so precise in its timing of popularity, there's this rather funny phenomenon that took place in the early 2000s, with the advent of digital color grading. In layman's terms, color grading is the art of tinting, saturating, and otherwise manipulating the colors of your footage after filming to better achieve the look and tone the director intended but could not achieve in camera. This is something that had been done for decades before, a lot of the time used to simply brighten a picture after a dark shoot. But this series landed just after that tinting process had gone from costing tens of thousands of dollars achieved through photochemical processes applied to physical film, to instead being free, accessible tool sets in professional editing software. Digital color grading emerged in prominence in the early 2000s, first really seen in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, shot by the legendary Roger Deakins. We have non-digital examples that came out around the same time as that, like The Matrix and Swordfish, which used photochemical tricks that created their distinctive tints, or Saving Private Ryan and Minority Report, which used ENR silver retention to add their grim, desaturated look. It wasn't something you could manipulate per frame, testing and retesting, adjusting anything beyond primary blue, green, and red shades. Right here now in my editing software, I can do more to the color grading for free in about 4 seconds than they could have done with thousands of dollars in a full laboratory setup. And that was a totally new thing. Many directors of photography hated these techniques and refused to make use of it, disagreeing with both the physical way of doing it and the digital. But the Lord of the Rings trilogy embraced this advancing technology with a visionary restraint that expanded the artistic value of every frame, adding to it on multiple levels, and presenting this fantasy world in a way that wasn't previously possible without turning it into some hacky rainbow that wouldn't hold up. I mean, they still had to go all out on at least a few shots though. You can't blame them for maybe having a bit too much fun with this from time to time, right? The late and great Andrew Lesnie is one of the many heroic members of this crew, being instrumental in bringing the now iconic look and tone of these movies to life, both in camera and when they were touched up after. The Lord of the Rings movies came at a time where not just CGI took a massive leap forward, the ability to produce computer-generated scenery and characters were the result of these massive steps forward. We wouldn't have 20,000 soldier fights or mythical creatures like the fiery Balrog brought to life without those. At every corner they were pioneering, making use of this brand new arsenal of computer-driven tools. And perhaps most impressive was the on-set work of Andy Serkis as Gollum as a leading example of the use of motion capture technology that has since defined Serkis's career and become a staple of the industry. For the first time, actors could physically share the scene with a CG character, allowing for immersive performances and in-camera interactivity. While the process has been refined a lot, even within the span of these movies, in many ways creating the technology necessary to do so, it's even more amazing seeing the practical ways they blended these. If Andy Serkis goes splashing around in water, you can't really edit him out without destroying the look of the water and the splashes. They then have to film and refilm this set with and without him, removing what they can, adding others back in, making use of visual effects and practical splashes. There was never a one-stop solution. Every simple-looking detail in these movies is the result of so many people putting forward the best of what they had to offer. The effects necessary to achieve Gollum at all were so new that they purposely excluded the character beyond this one obscured shot in Fellowship, because the technology needed to achieve any more than that was not ready in time to be applied to that first film. Luckily for us, The Lord of the Rings became the perfect outlet to test and develop these new techniques, while rarely being easy or cost-effective enough to ever be the obvious solution. And with this whole conversation being rather interconnected, I'm going to circle this back to the production team for a second. Those that worked on the miniatures actually had the craziest production schedule of anyone, starting their work building these well before filming began, straight through principal photography, and continuing to do so through post, essentially up to the Return of the King wrapped post-production. This entire team put in nearly 1,000 days designing, building, filming, and blowing up these mini monster sets. As many of you noticed and pointed out, in the original cut of this video, I skipped over the soundtrack entirely. That was likely a surprise to many, but my reasoning was twofold. One, everyone knows this soundtrack is one of the all-time best. Duh. I guess I just felt that it didn't need to be said. And two, that I didn't think there was anything that specific to this soundtrack that hadn't been done before. The former is a poor excuse in that this entire video already exists as a celebration of all things Lord of the Rings, and the musical accompaniment is a defining part of that experience for many, myself included. And the latter is apparently just completely untrue. It's been a lot of years since I watched the entirety of the behind the scenes, as was evident to many by myself repeatedly pronouncing things as Weta instead of Weta. It's been about a decade since I had ever heard it out loud, and I just got it wrong. But Shore was doing wildly innovative things, beyond simply making an insanely long soundtrack. I want it to feel old. I want to create a very specific sound for this story. I want it to feel like somebody discovered the score to The Lord of the Rings in a vault somewhere. Personally, it's one of the only film scores that I'll listen to outside of the movie itself. And I've had a few fun moments with it over the years, walking into a room and within a heartbeat knowing the precise scene being watched, simply by overhearing the music. That level of genius and mastery of the craft felt so apparent to me that it never made it into the original video. But you are all absolutely right, it not only deserves a mention, but its very own section. Plus, Howard Shore is Canadian, which I only just learned today and felt the need to include. Often assembling around 200, but up to 400 musicians, Shore composed 13 hours of music, accompanying and eclipsing the entirety of the runtime for the extended trilogy. It is considered by many to be the greatest film soundtrack of all time, often appearing in the #1 spot on lists made 20 years later. Shore's process involved reading all the books, then watching all the movies, and finally scoring those films with the books open on his desk to refer back to. He researched 2 centuries of music, spanning Celtic, Middle Eastern, and African folk traditions, as well as many Western influences, ensuring that the music complemented each race and faction and character with as much distinction and richness as the costumes and sets that surrounded them. Shore took it as a personal challenge to take the original languages crafted by Tolkien, then exploring them with enough depth to convert them into something musical. These movies make use of 6 uniquely crafted dialects developed by Tolkien himself. Language specialists were called in to help Shore convert each one into the International Phonetic Alphabet, so the performers could recreate them accurately without needing to memorize a full Elvish dictionary. As a side note, it just blows my mind that there are Tolkien language specialists. You're not a real fan until you have that on your resume. Shore would look up guest performers whenever he felt his own work was lacking, and if no suitable instrument could be found, he would straight up invent his own. They were out there whacking piano strings, playing around with these strings on fiddles, and bowing their lutes, all in an effort to create new sounds that better fit his intended tone and vision. While it's common for composers to play around with the acoustics of a space, moving around the microphones and testing recording techniques, Shore was so deep into the technical aspects of it that he was writing music with specific recording spaces in mind for each. Matching the pioneering efforts of the surrounding production, Shore decided to use unconventional orchestral organizations. Rather than seating everyone into traditionally delineated instrumental families, he instead grouped instruments into ranges of high, mid, and low sounds, independent of the type of instrument. This mixing and grouping was meant to create a more harmonious ensemble. As described in an uncredited quote I found, a high-range chord would underscore a tender moment, but within that single shape of sound resided a multitude of aural details. Flutes in octaves, oboes emphasizing inner harmonies, violins clustered 6 ways, shimmering harp tones, and female voices. I wish so badly that I could include examples of all of this, but film soundtracks are some of the most most difficult things to overcome with copyright rules on YouTube, which is also why this video isn't actually underscored by those film soundtracks. Kudos to you if you can pick out what it actually is instead. That's a little game for everyone in the comments. Many unique leitmotifs span the trilogy. Different events, characters, locations, races, and more are colored with their own distinct shades and influences. I've seen some contradicting numbers, but Shore shattered the record for the most leitmotifs of a single property in the history of cinema, landing somewhere a little over 100, easily surpassing the previous record held by the Star Wars franchise. My own tone-deaf musical ineptitude means I am limited in how precisely I am able to express my love and endless praise for Shore's work. So I'll instead turn to Fran Walsh's well-constructed insight into what she felt Howard brought to this trilogy. Howard Shore's ability to wrap his arms around a wide variety of musical forms to embrace both big and small moments on screen, his willingness to take creative risks, and above all else, his understanding that as a composer, his first obligation is to serve the needs of the story, brought new meaning to the notion of what an epic score could be. His work encompassed not only the vast, sweeping, and grand themes of the heroic, but also the intimate, fragile variations of the small. Howard's music made the worlds of the Shire and Gondor, Rohan and Lothlorien, Rivendell, Moria, and Mordor, to name a few, come to life in a very real way. He gave the cultures of the elves and the dwarves and the kingdoms of men a powerful authenticity, leading the audience to believe that this universe and these people perhaps at one time really existed. As I begin to close out this video, I want to zoom in for a moment to really highlight the perfect storm that led to what is still one of the greatest trilogies ever made. New techniques like color grading and motion capture are now standard practice. They individually don't really qualify as a never-to-be-seen-again component of these films, but it's worth admiring the ways Jackson and co. pioneered filmmaking, wisely selecting and wielding the best tool for each job rather than defaulting to what may now be seen as cheap shortcuts. Even by the time the third movie was released, we could see Jackson leaning more heavily on CGI, resulting in instances like the floaty green ghost horde or a rubbery video game Legolas completely defying physics. Many of these moments still look incredible, but in my mind really flirt with a questionable line by current standards. These moments that, didn't even look that good at the time, didn't really rear their head till that third movie. As silly as Legolas shield boarding down the stairs is, it still looks more believable because we can see that a real person is doing it. Viggo Mortensen has famously commented on the CGI bug that bit Jackson, coming to dominate his work ever since. Peter was always a geek in terms of technology, but once he had the means to do it, and the evolution of the technology really took off, he never looked back. In the first movie, yes, there's Rivendell and Mordor, but there's sort of an organic quality to it. Actors acting with each other and real landscapes. It's grittier. The second movie already started ballooning for my taste, and then by the third, there were a lot of special effects. It was grandiose and all that, but whatever was subtle in the first movie gradually got lost in the second and third. Now with The Hobbit, it's like that to the power of 10. There are countless things across these three movies that simply could not have existed without CGI. Yet there are so many practical solutions that would have lost that timeless appeal if it had been attempted with computer technology instead. As Viggo said, look no further than the Hobbit trilogy to see a direct example of how money and CGI cannot replace the love and respect for the source needed to create a classic film trilogy. Obviously, the Hobbit movies had loads of production issues, starting out as only 2 films with Guillermo del Toro set to direct. And by the time it was 3 movies and Peter Jackson was brought back on board, there was simply no time allotted to that previous route, even if the studio was willing to tolerate it. Layer that with Jackson's deepening love of special effects, and there was never much hope for those movies. We have shameful examples, like the Pale Orc going from this insane, horrific practical visual design to the rubbery CGI one we ended up with. The technology was better than ever for Gollum, and Smaug looks absolutely brilliant. But with just 2 of these movies costing more to make than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the general quality of the films themselves, I don't think anyone can really argue it was worth it. There are already moments in that trilogy that have aged more poorly than a lot of what was attempted with Lord of the Rings. Even comparing the behind the scenes of the Hobbit trilogy, it's almost tragic to watch. Everything was rushed, operating with an overinflated budget, while practical effects were traded for green screen and shortcuts, while also carrying the burden of somehow living up to those originals, all weighed against those films. While I'm sure production wasn't completely joyless, you can physically see Jackson's exhaustion in those making of the Hobbit videos, with Jackson often commenting on the struggles of production and how tired he felt, rather than staying up for 4 straight months of night shoots, sharing the wonder of what they were accomplishing. There's infamous moments like Sir Ian McKellen crying on set, claiming that performing alone on a green stage is not why he became an actor. And understandably so, my heart bleeds for him. They brought back as many elements from the Lord of the Rings as they could, tried to catch lightning in a bottle twice, and proved that it wasn't really meant to be. Peter Jackson's dedication to realism, the obvious enthusiasm from everyone involved, the passion to do the source material justice, and being given the resources to do it all, led to what is still the most critically acclaimed trilogy of all time, essentially sweeping the Academy Awards with Return of the King. For the record, while they didn't win every Oscar every year, it's pretty well accepted that the Academy realized it was about to be 3 consecutive no-contest years, and opted to give other movies a chance for those first 2 years. Physical sets, costumes, and more never have to worry about aging poorly, as there are no technological limitations that could have hindered their creation. Yet, the timing was right to give the audience otherworldly environments, creatures, and set pieces believably interacting with all the affectionately hand-built components. The practical and visual effects work to perfectly capture and blend the imaginations of both Tolkien and this film crew to deliver something that transcends the medium. I still believe The Lord of the Rings are some of the best movies ever made, and a magical culmination of 1,000 perfectly timed people and events, opportunities and limitations, risk-takers and dreamers, and so much more. In the time between making the original cut of this video and now, The Rings of Power Season 1 has been released. I haven't even watched it yet. But if you are interested, maybe if this hits like, I don't know, 100,000 views on this channel, then I'll do a review of that season. And I do mean a review, not like a behind the scenes look at things like this, although I'm sure I'll tie some of that in, since how can you not talk about the trade-offs of practical effects and CGI in a show that cost $250 million? But yeah, I'm never gonna be upset about talking more Lord of the Rings here on the channel. You'll have to let me know. These movies were released at a formative time in my life and set the bar at a young age for what movies could achieve. My mom loves to tell the story of me being so scared of the orcs after seeing Fellowship in theaters at 8 years old that I insisted on sleeping in their room that night. By the time The Two Towers rolled around, that was long forgotten and I had become a zealot, rewatching that movie over and over. At this point, I have watched the extended trilogy every winter since its release, and will likely continue to do so for the rest of my life. If you have ever seen these movies 100, a dozen, or 0 times, I highly recommend that you set aside some time over the holidays, set your phone aside, and give the trilogy your full attention for its 20th anniversary. Maybe even watch those behind the scenes videos if you've never done that before. Soak in the majesty of it all, because the result is something to be treasured, and each of the 3 films has earned its status as one of the greatest films ever made. And collectively, this trilogy is on a scale of realized ambition that set it apart from everything else, and will likely never see anything quite like it again.